The ice cracked beneath Eric Stormborn's feet, like the laughter of dying men, a sound he knew too well from 30 years of warfare and raiding. He stood alone on the frozen lake called Skelti, 2 days' journey from any settlement, watching his youngest son Halvard sink beneath the black water, the boy's fingers clawing uselessly at ice too thin to support his weight. Ulrich had been walking ahead, testing the route across the lake that would save them 3 days on their journey to Uppsala, when he heard the crack and the splash and turned to see Halvard disappearing into water so cold it killed in minutes. Now Ulrich ran back across ice that groaned and shifted with every step, his heart hammering against his ribs, knowing he was too far away, knowing he would never reach the boy in time, knowing that he was about to watch his son die because of his own arrogance and impatience. Halvard was 13 winters old, the youngest of Eric's 4 sons, the gentle one who preferred books and learning to swords and battle. The other 3 sons were warriors already, tested in raids, blooded and hardened, the kind of men who would carry their father's reputation into the next generation. Ragnar was 22, already leading his own raids along the Frisian coast. Bjorn was 19, serving as a Hussars champion in Norway. Knut was 16, eager and fierce, counting the days until he could join his brothers in the shield wall. But Halvard was different, sensitive and thoughtful, more interested in the old stories and the runes than in the glory of combat. Eric had always been slightly disappointed by this youngest child, had pushed him harder than the others, trying to forge him into something he was not. This journey to Uppsala had been part of that effort, a pilgrimage to the great temple where Halvard would be initiated into manhood, where perhaps the gods would grant him the courage and strength his father believed he lacked. Now that journey was ending in tragedy, and Eric understood with terrible clarity that he had killed his son through his own pride and stupidity. Eric reached the hole in the ice, threw himself flat to distribute his weight, reached down into water that burned his hand with cold. His fingers found fabric, then flesh, and he hauled with all his strength, dragging Halvard up through the jagged ice, pulling the boy onto the surface even as the ice continued to crack around them in a spiderweb pattern that threatened to collapse entirely. Halvard was blue-lipped and gasping, his eyes rolled back, his body convulsing with violent shivers that Eric recognized as the first stage of death by cold. He had seen men die this way before, after falling into winter rivers during campaigns, had watched the life drain from them as their bodies simply gave up the fight against the killing temperature. He would not let that happen to Halvard, could not let it happen. Eric dragged his son away from the hole, away from the weakest ice, back toward the shore they had left perhaps 100 yards behind. Every yard was agony, every moment expecting the ice to give way completely and send them both plunging into the killing cold. Halvard's weight seemed to double with each foot they traveled, the boy's soaked clothes and gear adding pounds that Eric's arms screamed in protest at carrying. But he did not stop, did not slow, driven by a terror more profound than anything he had experienced in 3 decades of battle. In war, death was a known quantity, a risk accepted and planned for. This was different. This was his child, his blood, dying because Eric had been too arrogant to listen when Halvard said the ice looked thin, too impatient to take the safer route around the lake's edge, too convinced of his own infallibility to consider that a 13-year-old boy might see danger more clearly than a veteran warrior. They reached the shore and Eric collapsed, his lungs burning, his muscles trembling with exhaustion, but there was no time to rest. Halvard was dying. Eric could see it in the blue tinge spreading from his lips across his cheeks, in the way his breathing had gone shallow and irregular, in the terrible coldness of his flesh that felt more like touching a corpse than a living child. The boy needed warmth immediately, needed fire and dry clothes and shelter from the wind that was beginning to rise across the lake, bringing with it the promise of a storm that would turn their situation from desperate to impossible. Eric forced himself to his feet, scanning the landscape with the tactical awareness that had kept him alive through countless battles. They were in mountainous country, the shores of Lake Skolfti, hemmed in by steep hills covered in pine and birch. The nearest farmstead was at least 6 hours hard travel, probably more in their current condition, and Halvard did not have 6 hours, he might not have 1 hour. Erik needed shelter now, this moment, and as if the gods had heard his desperate prayer, he saw it, a dark opening in the hillside, perhaps 50 yards from where they stood, partially hidden by dead brush and drifted snow. A cave, small but sufficient, a place to get out of the wind, a space where Erik might be able to build a fire if his flint and steel had survived the soaking. He gathered Halvard into his arms, cradling the boy against his chest the way he had when Halvard was an infant, and staggered toward the cave. His own body was beginning to shake with cold now, his wet clothes freezing in the bitter air, ice forming in his beard and hair. Each step was a battle against exhaustion and growing numbness, but Erik had fought too many battles to lose this one. He reached the cave mouth and ducked inside, finding himself in a space perhaps 10 feet wide and extending back into darkness. The floor was rocky but relatively dry, and most importantly, the wind did not penetrate more than a few feet into the interior. Erik laid Halvard on the driest ground he could find, then forced his frozen fingers to work, stripping the boy of his soaked clothing. Halvard's skin was white as snow, marbled with blue, and he had stopped shivering, which Erik knew was a terrible sign. When a body stopped fighting the cold, death was close. He wrapped Halvard in both their cloaks, then stumbled back outside to gather firewood. The forest provided deadfall branches, bark, anything that would burn, and Erik worked with manic energy, breaking wood with hands that had lost most of their feeling, building a fire pit with stones, creating a structure that could sustain flame. His flint and steel were in a leather pouch that had stayed mostly dry, and he sent a prayer of thanks to whatever god was listening. But his hands shook so badly he could barely hold the tools, and striking a spark in his condition seemed almost impossible. The first 10 attempts produced nothing. The 20th attempt gave him a weak spark that died immediately. On the 33rd try, nearly weeping with frustration and fear, he finally got a spark into the tinder nest he had prepared from shredded bark and dry grass. The spark caught, glowed, began to smoke. Erik bent close and blew gently, nursing the fragile ember, feeding it with the care he would show to a newborn child. The smoke thickened, turned to flame, and suddenly fire was crawling through the tinder, reaching for the small kindling he had arranged, growing from spark to blaze with agonizing slowness. When the fire was established enough to sustain itself, Erik stripped his own wet clothes and hung them near the flames to dry. Then he pulled Halvard close to the fire, tucking the boy against his own body, using his flesh to share what warmth remained. For hours they stayed like that, Erik holding Halvard, speaking to him constantly, begging him not to die, promising things he was not sure he could deliver, but willing to promise anything if it would keep his son alive. "Stay with me," Erik whispered into Halvard's wet hair. "Stay with me, boy. You are stronger than you know. You are braver than I ever gave you credit for. I know you did not want to cross the ice. I know you were afraid. You were right to be afraid, and I was a fool not to listen. But you can survive this. You have survived worse, survived having me as a father, survived 13 years of my disappointment and my pressure and my complete failure to see you for who you truly are. If you can survive that, you can survive a little cold water. Just stay with me a little longer. Let the fire do its work. Let your body remember how to be warm. Please, Halvard, please do not leave me. I cannot lose you. I cannot bear it. You are my son, my child, and I love you more than my own life, even if I have done a terrible job of showing it." The words poured out of Erik like blood from a wound, things he had never said aloud, feelings he had buried beneath the armor of warrior pride and masculine stoicism. He spoke of his fears for Halvard, his worry that the boy was too gentle for a harsh world, his desperate attempts to harden him that had only driven them apart. He spoke of his own father, a brutal man who had beaten strength into his sons and called it love, and how Erik had sworn never to be like that, but had failed anyway, had simply found different ways to damage his children. He spoke of Halvard's mother, dead these 5 years from a sickness that no healer could cure, and how much he missed her wisdom, her ability to see people clearly and love them for who they were, rather than who she wished they would become. Slowly, agonizingly slowly, Halvard's breathing steadied. The blue tinge faded from his lips, replaced by a faint pink that looked like life returning. His body stopped convulsing and began to relax into something resembling sleep. Eric wept with relief, great racking sobs that he had not allowed himself since his wife's death, tears that froze on his cheeks in the cold air beyond the fire's warmth. He had come so close to losing Halvard, so terribly close, and the knowledge of how easily it could have ended differently shook him to his core. He looked down at his youngest son's face, peaceful now in the firelight, and felt a love so fierce and protective it was almost painful. This boy was his child, his blood, his responsibility, and Eric had nearly killed him through carelessness and pride. That failure would haunt him, he knew, would mark him in ways that no battle scar ever had. Night fell, turning the cave mouth from grey to black, the fire becoming their only light in a world of darkness. Eric kept the flames burning, feeding wood constantly, not daring to let them fade. He dozed occasionally, exhaustion pulling at him like an undertow, but never deeply, always aware of Halvard's breathing, always monitoring the fire, always ready to wake fully if needed. Around midnight, by Eric's best guess at time, in a place with no sun or stars to guide him, Halvard stirred and opened his eyes. He looked at his father with confusion, then growing awareness, then something that might have been fear. "Father!" His voice was hoarse, barely a whisper, roughened by the water he had swallowed and the cold that had nearly killed him. "What happened? Where are we?" "You fell through the ice," Eric said gently, his hand moving to stroke Halvard's wet hair back from his forehead in a gesture of tenderness he rarely allowed himself. "I pulled you out. We are in a cave, waiting for morning, waiting for you to be strong enough to travel. Rest now. You are safe. I will not let anything happen to you." But Halvard's expression did not relax. Instead, his eyes grew wide, focused on something behind Eric, something in the depths of the cave where the firelight did not reach. "Father," he whispered, his voice tight with a fear that had nothing to do with cold or drowning. "There is someone here, someone watching us from the darkness." Eric turned, his hand instinctively reaching for the knife at his belt, the only weapon he had managed to keep through the ordeal. The cave extended back into blackness that the firelight could not penetrate, and in that blackness something moved. Not the scurrying of a small animal or the flutter of bats disturbed by their presence, but deliberate movement, the shift of something large and aware. Eric grabbed a burning branch from the fire and held it high, peering into the gloom, his warrior's instincts screaming danger, even as his rational mind insisted there could be nothing here, no threat in this empty cave in the middle of wilderness. What he saw made his blood run cold in a way the lake water had not managed. Deep in the cave, perhaps 20 feet back from where they huddled by the fire, sat a figure. It was impossibly old, withered beyond any natural aging, the skin dried to leather over bones that seemed too prominent, too visible beneath the parchment flesh. The figure wore rags that might once have been fine clothes, embroidered wool and silk rotted to tatters, hanging from the skeletal frame like grave wrappings. Its face was a skull thinly covered in skin, the eyes sunken but gleaming with a terrible awareness, reflecting the torchlight like an animal's eyes, but with something behind them that was far too intelligent, far too human. It sat perfectly still, hands resting on knees that jutted like knobs through the remains of its clothing, and Eric realized with dawning horror that this thing had been here the entire time, sitting in the darkness, observing as he fought to save his son's life, watching their desperate struggle with the patience of something that had all the time in the world. "Who are you?" Eric demanded, trying to keep his voice steady, trying to project the confidence of a warrior who had faced death 100 times. But his hand shook slightly, making the torch waver, and he felt Halvard press against his back, the boy's fingers clutching at his father's arm with renewed fear. "What do you want? What are you doing in this cave?" The figure did not move, did not blink, but when it spoke its voice filled the cave like wind through a burial mound, hollow and ancient, and laden with a weight that pressed against Eric's chest like a physical force. "I am what remains when ambition consumes all else. I am the price of pride. I am the warning that no one heeds until it is too late. I was once like you, warrior, strong and certain, convinced of my own rightness, believing that will and strength could overcome any obstacle, that my judgment was superior to all others. I came to these mountains 300 winters ago, seeking power, seeking knowledge that would make me greater than other men. I found what I sought, and it destroyed me." Eirik stared at the thing, his mind struggling to accept what he was seeing, what he was hearing. 300 years. That was not possible. No man lived 300 years. No man could survive 3 centuries sitting in a cave. Yet the evidence sat before him, undeniable and terrible. "What happened to you?" he asked, his voice barely above a whisper. "How did you come to be like this?" "I sought the secret of immortality," the figure said, and there was something in its voice that might have been bitter laughter. "I found it after a fashion. I cannot die. My body does not age beyond what you see before you. Disease cannot touch me. Hunger and thirst are distant memories. I exist beyond death, trapped in this moment, this form, unable to change, unable to escape. For 300 winters I have sat in this darkness, conscious of every moment, every hour, every year of my imprisonment. I have watched the seasons turn through the cave mouth. I have seen travelers occasionally stumble past, never seeing me, never knowing I was here. I have thought 10,000 thoughts, relived every moment of my life 1,000,000 times, and I will continue to do so for 300 more years, and 300 after that, until the mountains crumble to dust and the world ends. This is my fate. This is what I earned through pride, through the arrogant certainty that I knew better than the wisdom of ages, that I could take what I wanted without consequence." Halvard made a small sound of horror, and Eirik pulled him closer, protective instincts overwhelming his own fear. "Why are you telling us this?" he asked. "What do you want from us?" "Nothing," the ancient figure said. "I want nothing because I can have nothing, can do nothing, am nothing but awareness trapped in decay. But I can still speak. When someone wanders into my prison, I can still offer warning to those who might yet be saved from my fate. And you, warrior, you stand where I once stood. I can see it in you, the same pride that destroyed me, the same certainty that you know best, that your way is right, that others exist to serve your vision of how things should be. You nearly killed your son today through that pride. You pushed him onto dangerous ice because you were impatient, because you valued speed over safety, because you did not listen when he told you he was afraid." The words struck Eirik like axe blows, each one finding its mark, exposing truths he had been trying not to see. He wanted to argue, to defend himself, to claim that the ancient thing was wrong, but he could not, because every accusation was true. He had not listened to Halvard's warnings about the ice. He had dismissed the boy's fear as weakness, as another example of his youngest son's disappointing lack of courage. He had been impatient, eager to reach Uppsala quickly, to complete this journey that was really about proving something to himself rather than helping Halvard. And his pride, his absolute certainty in his own judgment, had nearly cost his son's life. "If this cave had not been here," the figure continued relentlessly, "if you had not found shelter, your son would be dead now, frozen in your arms, and you would carry that guilt for the rest of your days. You were given a chance, a gift that I was never granted. You can choose differently. You can see what you are becoming before it is too late. The question is whether you will, whether you can set aside your pride long enough to change, or whether you will continue down the path I walked, convinced of your rightness until the moment you realize you have destroyed everything you love. I cannot force you to choose wisely. I can only show you where the path of pride leads, and hope that my suffering serves as sufficient warning." Eirik sank to his knees, still holding Halvard, his mind reeling from the encounter and the truths it had forced him to confront. He thought about the journey to Uppsala, about why he had really insisted Halvard come, not for the boy's benefit, not to help him find his path, but for Eirik's own pride, to prove to the world that all his sons were warriors, that there was no weakness in his bloodline, that Eirik Stormborn had failed at nothing, not even fatherhood. He thought about pushing across the lake despite Halvard's fear, despite the clear signs that the ice was not safe, because admitting uncertainty felt like admitting weakness, and weakness was something Eirik had spent his entire life trying to purge from himself and his children. He thought about 30 years of similar choices, small cruelties and large ones, moments when he had valued his reputation over his family's well-being, his pride over their happiness. He thought about his older sons, scattered across the north pursuing glory in battle, and realized he barely knew them, had no idea what they dreamed about or feared or hoped for beyond the narrow vision of warrior excellence he had imposed upon them. He thought about his wife, how she had tried to tell him he was being too hard on the boys, too demanding, too focused on making them into copies of himself, rather than letting them become themselves. He had dismissed her concerns, had told her she was too soft, did not understand what the world required of men. Now she was dead, and he had never apologized, had never admitted that maybe she had been right, that maybe his way was not the only way, or even the best way. "What should I do?" Ishrik asked, his voice breaking, tears streaming down his scarred face. "How do I stop becoming what you are? How do I change when I do not even know where to begin?" "Listen," the figure said, and for the first time its voice held something other than bitterness and despair. It held what might have been hope, faint and fragile but genuine. "Listen to the people who love you. Listen to their fears and their needs and their wisdom. Your son did not want to cross the ice. He told you it was dangerous. But you did not listen, because listening felt like submission, like weakness, like allowing a child to overrule a warrior's judgment. You valued your own certainty over his instinct for survival. That is pride. That is the poison that will destroy you if you let it. The cure is simple to describe, but difficult to practice. Humble yourself. Accept that you do not always know best. Accept that strength includes the ability to change your mind, to admit error, to prioritize others over your own ego. Do this, and you may yet avoid my fate. Fail, and one day you will sit alone in darkness, trapped by the consequences of your own arrogance, with nothing but regret for company and an eternity to contemplate your failures. The figure fell silent then, and despite Eric's questions, despite his desperate pleas for more guidance, it did not speak again. As dawn light began to filter into the cave, pale and cold, Eric saw that the ancient thing was more statue than man, encrusted with mineral deposits from centuries of sitting in the damp darkness, barely distinguishable from the stone around it. He wondered if it had truly spoken, or if exhaustion and fear had made him imagine the conversation, had conjured a phantom to externalize the guilt he felt over nearly killing his son. But the words remained, burned into his memory, impossible to dismiss or forget, and in the end it did not matter whether the encounter had been real or hallucination. The truth it had revealed was real enough. When Halvard was strong enough to travel, warmed and fed and dressed in their dried clothes, they left the cave and made their way slowly back towards civilization. They did not continue to Uppsala. Eric asked his son what he wanted, truly wanted, and when Halvard said he wanted to go home, wanted to see his brothers, wanted to stop this journey that had nearly killed him, Eric agreed without argument. They traveled south instead of north, back to their farmstead in Denmark, where Halvard's brothers and grandmother waited. The journey took a week, moving slowly to accommodate Halvard's weakened condition, and during those days, Eric spoke with his son properly for the first time in years, not lecturing or commanding, but actually listening, hearing Halvard's dreams and fears and hopes. The boy wanted to be a skald, wanted to learn the old stories and create new ones, wanted to preserve the history and wisdom of their people in verse and song. He had talent for it, Eric realized, a gift for words and rhythm that his older sons did not possess. It was a noble calling, perhaps nobler than the warrior's path Eric had always glorified, but he had been too proud, too certain of his own vision for his sons' futures, to see that truth. Too convinced that there was only one way to be a man, one path to honor and respect, and that path looked exactly like the one Eric himself had walked. At home, Eric gathered his family and told them what had happened, sparing no detail of his failure, his arrogance, his near destruction of his youngest son. His other sons listened in shocked silence, unused to hearing their father admit error or weakness. Halvard's grandmother wept, whether from relief that the boy had survived or grief over how close they had come to losing him, Eric could not tell. Then Eric did something he had never done before, something that felt like tearing out his own heart. He apologized. He asked their forgiveness for being a poor father, for valuing his pride over their well-being, for trying to force them into shapes that served his ego rather than their true natures. And he promised to change, to listen, to be better, even if being better meant admitting he had been wrong about almost everything he had believed about strength and manhood and what it meant to be a father. The years that followed were not easy. Changing deeply ingrained patterns never is, especially for a man in his 5th decade who had built his entire identity around certainty and strength. But Eirik tried, genuinely tried, and slowly his relationships with his sons deepened and strengthened. Halvard studied with the best skalds in Denmark, learning the ancient verses and the art of composition, and eventually created works that were sung in halls across the north. Eirik learned to take as much pride in his youngest son's poetry as he did in Ragnar's prowess as a raider, or Bjorn's skill as a champion, or Knut's courage in battle. He learned that there were many ways to be strong, many paths to honor, and that trying to force everyone into the same narrow mold was not strength but weakness, not wisdom but stupidity. When Eirik's time came, many years later, he died peacefully in his bed surrounded by all 4 of his sons, their wives, his grandchildren. His last words were to Halvard, spoken in a whisper that only the boy, now a man of 40, could hear. "Thank you for being strong enough to be yourself despite me. Thank you for teaching me that love is more important than pride, that listening is harder than commanding, that the best thing a father can do is help his children become themselves, rather than trying to make them into copies of him. I am sorry it took me so long to learn. I am sorry I nearly killed you learning it, but I am grateful, so grateful, that I was given the chance to change before it was too late." They buried Eirik on a hill overlooking the sea, and on his memorial stone Halvard carved words that became famous throughout the north. "Here lies Eirik Stormborn, warrior and father, who was strong enough to change his mind, brave enough to admit error, wise enough to listen to those he had dismissed. May we all have such courage." And sometimes on winter nights when the wind howled and families gathered around their fires, Halvard would tell his children and grandchildren about the frozen lake and the cave and the ancient figure trapped by pride, and about the day his father chose a different path. The story spread, becoming legend, a warning about the dangers of arrogance and a testament to the possibility of redemption, passed down through generations as a reminder that the hardest battles are not fought with swords but with ourselves, and that true strength lies not in never falling, but in choosing to rise changed.